All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 6, A New Nation. So, Chapter 6 picks up with the conclusion of the American Revolutionary War and focuses on some of the early years of American history. And essentially, there are two sort of major sections, I would say. We have the period of the Confederation. Recall that we talked about the Articles of Confederation in the last chapter. This was the first government or first constitution of the United States, Confederation. And the Confederation period, we'll say, stretches from 1776, which is the Declaration of Independence, to roughly 1789. As we'll cover here in a moment, eventually the Confederation or the Articles of Confederation is gotten rid of, and the United States institutes a new national government. That national government is the Constitution. And once the Constitution is enacted, we begin to move into this period known as the Early Republic. And the Early Republic is essentially the early years of the United States with the US Constitution intact. This stretches roughly from 1789 till about 1815. This chapter is not going to get quite up to that moment, but typically speaking, we say that's the early republic period, the first couple of presidents. So we'll span, the transition from the Confederation government into the early republic government. And, the image that we're presented with at the very beginning of this chapter, this is I don't know if I'd call it like a propaganda piece or, it's encouraging the states to ratify the new constitution to get rid of the old Confederation government. So, one important thing to keep in mind when we talk about early American history, especially following the American Revolution, is that we understand or we might know that we have after the American Revolution a new nation, and to avoid any confusion, this is the United States. The United States comes into existence after 1776. But as a new nation, it's easy to overlook just how vulnerable the United States was at the time, just how weak the United States was at the time, and just how much uncertainty there was about the future. Sometimes I like to use this term, the experiment in liberty, to describe the US because at the time it really was an experiment. Now today we know the experiment works, but back then they didn't know if it was going to work out or not. So the new nation was especially vulnerable to outside threats, vulnerable to interior threats. There was a certain degree of uncertainty. And yeah, it was somewhat of an experiment. It makes this early Republican Confederation period, every single crisis has the potential to end this experiment, right? So every single crisis is of the utmost importance. It's seemingly life and death with every issue that arises. Now, at the same time, though, what the United States did have working for it was a sense of national unity. Maybe not as unified as people thought back then, but certainly there was a sense, especially in the early years, that with victory over the British, that a lot of people were willing to set aside maybe their own personal and local interests for the betterment of the nation. And perhaps the most perfect example of this sense of unity was George Washington, who arguably there has never been a figure in American history that has been less uncontroversial than Washington. Washington was the personification of unity. Everyone in the country, North, South, Federalist, Republican, tended to respect, revere, and maybe even obey what Washington said. So, also to kind of illustrate this point, this sort of notion of the spirit of 76, right? Spirit of 1776 um, informs us about the way that Americans were unified. There tends to be goodwill early on, and as we progress through American history, especially from this point forward. Some of that goodwill tends to fade away. Americans are less unified, eventually culminating in an all-out civil war. So recall from the last section that with the creation of the United States, we had the formation of 14 different governments, 13 state governments, and one national government. The national government was the Articles of Confederation. This is the first national government. And the most important feature of the Articles of Confederation was that it simply was too weak to function. And this came up in a lot of different forms, pretty much the inability. The tax was a big one, to regulate commerce. And this was especially troubling given the American economy, which, was very bad and poor economy following the American Revolutionary War. The Americans had war debt to pay off. The war had disrupted the American economy. A lot of inflation took place during the Revolutionary War. So, the inability for the Articles to tax, the inability for the Articles to regulate commerce, it simply means that the Articles government doesn't have the tools required in order to solve the problems of the day. Now, there is an additional crisis that comes up during the Confederation period that pushes particularly people like Washington. And again, Washington is the one guy that has somewhat of, not just somewhat, but has a universal respect. And that's Shays' Rebellion. And this causes Washington to worry about the future of the Articles of Confederation because you already have other kind of leading figures that are calling for an alteration to this government, but they're the ones that are mostly involved in the economy, or at least concerned about the economy. Washington's not really an economic guy. He's more of a military guy. And Shays' Rebellion will help convince Washington that, yes, a lot of his peers are correct in saying that the Confederation needs to be altered and that some change is necessary. That incident is Shays' Rebellion, right? Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is a rebellion in Massachusetts by farmers against taxation. We might also include within the farmers veterans of the American Revolutionary War, including Daniel Shays, who had fought on the American side. And when this rebellion broke out in Western Massachusetts, what Washington and others realized was that the Articles of Confederation did not provide the tools necessary to deal with something like an armed insurrection. And Washington thought, well, if these farmers can cause so much trouble, now eventually the revolt was put down, but it did take a while. If these farmers could cause so much trouble, what did it mean for the United States to not be able to defend itself, perhaps against a foreign country, right? And so Shays' Rebellion, we might say, it revealed the weakness of the Confederation to deal with, we'll just say, armed conflict. Of course, this was an internal rebellion, and the most logical conclusion from Shays' Rebellion might be, well, we need a stronger government to deal with internal rebellion. But you could just take that same, that same idea and say, well, if the United States has a hard time dealing with a bunch of farmers in Massachusetts, what is it going to be like if the United States goes to war? It's going to be a complete disaster. And so people who are a little bit more like-minded to Washington and involved in the military, they joined some of these other founding figures like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and said, look, we really need to do something about this government. We need something better, something stronger to deal with the types of problems that the nation faces. Now, not everyone's going to agree. And in fact, we have 3 quotes from 3 different national figures that represent the different types of viewpoints when it came to what type of government do we want to have? On the one side, there were those who were the most alarmed by Shays' rebellion. Benjamin Lincoln says, quote, Shays' rebellion was a state of anarchy, confusion, and slavery. And this sentiment is essentially a fear of anarchy. We might say fear from below. And the sentiment, which lined up very well with Shays' rebellion, was, if we don't have a strong enough government, then the people could rise up and cause a lot of harm and cause a lot of damage. And so, in order to avoid a state of anarchy, in order to avoid a state of confusion and slavery, we need a stronger national government to control the masses. Well, Thomas Jefferson actually didn't think that Shays' rebellion was all that alarming. In fact, Thomas Jefferson remarked, quote, a little rebellion now and then helps keep the country free. So Jefferson is not really afraid of the masses. He's not afraid of the crowd. This is a fear of tyranny. Again, you have those people who are advocating, look, we need a stronger national government. Jefferson says, wait a minute. We don't want too strong of a national government, because if a national government is too strong, then it could be tyrannical over the population. And maybe a little rebellion isn't such a bad thing. It kind of keeps those who are in power at bay. This is a fear, we'll say, of the above. Fear from above? Does that make sense? Yeah, fear from above. And then we have James Madison, who is right in the middle, who, really expresses the viewpoint of the balancing act that a lot of the founders are going to trying to be doing here, right? We want a system that works, but is not tyrannical. We want a system that allows democracy, that allows people to have a voice, but we don't want it to be so open and loose that it's just outright anarchy. So James Madison remarks, quote, liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty, aka the anarchy, as well as the abuses of power, aka from tyranny. The question is, can the United States find a position in the middle here that balances these two positions in just the right way? Section 3, the Constitutional Convention. So the founders had become worried about the status of the nation enough to agree to meet. And they met in 1787 in Philadelphia in what was known as the Constitutional Convention. So this was a meeting by the nation's leaders. These figures are sometimes referred to as the founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin was there, George Washington was there, James Madison, who you see pictured here, was there, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. A meeting by the nation's leaders to, and initially this is what the convention was supposed to be about, to revise the articles. Initially, they said, look, this government is not working. We have a lot of problems. We have problems with rebellion. We have problems with the economy. We have problems with debt. We have problems with taxes. Let's go ahead and revise the articles. By the time that they actually got there, they decided that instead of revising it, they would just create a brand new government. I will say in Philadelphia. 1787, decided to simply rewrite the Constitution. And of all the issues at the convention, I would say that there was a general consensus about, and maybe even the most important and pressing issue was the issue of taxes. At this point, most of the people at the convention understood that, especially with the debt, right, the war debt from the Revolutionary War, that having a national government without the inability to tax was the most serious problem. And because of that, most agreed that taxes ought to be, that this new national government ought to have the ability to tax. So that was the most pressing concern, but also one of the lesser controversial things at the convention. Most people had come around. Now, in terms of the Constitution, it was a group project. These were 55 men. These were mostly from the elite classes of society. So, we're talking about the educated, the wealthy, and many of them also had military servants. And so the document that they created, or the document that they sought out to create in this, sort of balance between, again, on one side, and we talked about this in the last section, on one side you have democracy, on the other side you have tyranny. Um, but at the same time, democracy also comes with its downsides. You don't want it to be so democratic that it's, chaos and anarchy. And really, what you're trying to do is, those who are in favor of a stronger government, they wouldn't call it tyrannical. That's essentially what the critics would say. They would say, look, we want a strong but effective government. And that's really the trade off. You want a democracy with the potential of chaos and anarchy, or do you want a strong, effective government with the downside of tyranny, right? That's a possibility. At the Constitution or the Constitutional Convention, they were moving this way. That is to say, that the overall purpose of the Constitution was to create a stronger, more effective government. And those who were critical of the US Constitution would say, look, we have to be careful for tyranny. Now, it was a group project, but if we had to say that there was a main author to the US Constitution, we would say James Madison, the primary author of the Constitution. If we had to pin it on one person. Now, as far as what should be done, again, most agreed that moving towards a more effective government was ideal. That regulation of business needs to be included. That taxes need to be included. But there were a lot of disagreements at the Constitutional Convention, and probably the most important disagreement, or maybe not most important, but maybe the most lively disagreement, was over the question of representation. That is, how should the states be represented in the new national government? And the states were divided. On the one side, you had the bigger states, and by bigger states, we mean those that were in favor of, by bigger, we mean bigger in terms of population. Those people supported what was called the Virginia Plan, and Virginia Plan that was from James Madison, from the state of Virginia. It proposed, amongst other things, a strong federal government. It proposed 3 branches, like some state constitutions, specifically that was in Massachusetts. But on the question of representation, and this is where some of the controversy or debate lied, the Virginia Plan proposed representation based on population. That is to say that states with bigger populations get more votes. That was the idea. Now, some of these or some parts of the Virginia Plan were agreed upon. So, for the most part, a stronger federal government would be created. The Constitution would create 3 branches. But this point here about representation based off population, that wasn't supported by some of the states, namely the small states. And so the small states with lower populations said, look, we don't want representation based off population. We want it the old way. And the old way, and I don't know if we actually mentioned this, but was one state, one vote. And this notion of one state, one vote had gone back all the way to the period of the Revolution, where at the Continental Congresses, they tried to make a point to say, look, all the colonies are equal, so they have an equal say. And so when they decided to declare independence, for example, each colony got one vote or one say. That was brought into the Confederation period, one state, one vote. Now, in the New Jersey plan, we'll say supported by small states, and they wanted representation to be one state, one vote, right? They wanted to keep things the way that it was. Which one was more democratic? It was the Virginia plan, right? When you base it off population, it says that people have more of a say. This sort of distorts political power, one state, one vote, when you think about population. So big states said we want population. Small states said one state, one vote. Eventually, the two sides came to a compromise. That's to say that neither side got exactly what they wanted, and the compromise was to create a bicameral, which just means two-body Congress, right, or legislative branch. And in Congress, the House of Representatives would be based off population. So in the House, we call it the House for short. The more people a state has, the more votes that they get. But it also created the U.S. Senate. Now, both the Senate and the House are part of the U.S. Congress, and this is one state, two votes, actually. So each state gets a senator. So the United States Congress, as we call it, otherwise referred to as the legislative branch, which means lawmaking, has two different, I guess, houses or congresses that they have to get passed, the House and the Senate. And in order for a law to be enacted, a law has to pass both the House and both the Senate. So this was seen as a compromise that both sides wanted. Those that were the bigger states got what they wanted in the House of Representatives, more people, more votes. And those that favor the smaller states got what they wanted in the Senate, where it's one state, two votes. A law has to get by both of them. Now, another good example of how the United States Constitution was trying to kind of balance this system here, right? To try and find a medium between a strong, effective government that still retains the will of the people and still remains democratic, is the way in which the US president was elected. So amongst the other things that the Constitution created was the executive branch. The United States would have a president, right, or an executive. But how do we choose that president? Well, on the one hand, you might say something like a straight popular vote. That would be on the side of being the most democratic, or at least, about as democratic as you could be in those days. And then on the other side, you might have something like an appointment, right? So this is typically the way that like prime ministers are chosen in a lot of European parliaments, is that you elect the Congress and then the Congress chooses the prime minister or chooses the president for you. So it's a way of choosing a president where you don't really leave it up to the people. Well, in our US Constitution, we created a somewhat of a unique system that you don't really find in a lot of other places, and it's called the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a way, we'll say, a way to choose the president based on electors. So pretty much the way that it works is that a state's population gives them a certain number of electors. So in this sense, it is trying to reflect a little bit of the democratic sentiment, right? The idea is that states that have more people, they're going to get more electors when it comes to choosing the president. But at the end of the day, the electors choose or are chosen to vote for a president. So it's not direct democracy in the sense that people are voting for the president. It's that the population determines how many electors each state gets. And then, especially in the early period of American history, a lot of this has changed since then. But those electors could then pretty much choose whoever they wanted. They weren't necessarily bound by the popular vote. So the Electoral College is a great example of, again, it's kind of a bizarre, kind of unique system as far as other democracies around the world, but it's a great example of how exactly the founders were trying to strike this balance. And of course, as our system has become more democratic over time, in the United States, the Electoral College is often the target of a lot of scrutiny because it was designed purposely to not be essentially as democratic as possible, right? They were trying to create a more efficient way of choosing a president. And the idea back then is that these electors that are chosen, they're going to be a little bit more well informed. They're going to be a little bit more invested in the country. The idea was that if you leave it up to popular vote, the people aren't always going to choose the right person. So why don't we create these sort of electors and as sort of leading citizens, as the informed, ruling class, they'll make a better choice. Again, an example of trying to find the happy medium on this scale. Now, when the document was finished, it was sent to the states for ratification, meaning that 55 men sat in a room in Pennsylvania, created this document, but it needed to be approved by the state governments. And so when it was published in the newspapers around the United States at the time, people took up one of two positions. One group was the Anti Federalists. They said, vote no on the Constitution. They didn't like what came out of it. Namely, probably your leading anti-federalist would have been somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who thought that some parts of the Constitution are okay, but again, Jefferson very fearful of having a government too strong that it can abuse its powers. The Federalists were the ones that were said vote yes on the Constitution. Right? Of course, those who had actually created the Constitution in Philadelphia were amongst the Federalists, people like George Washington, Ben Franklin. The leading Federalist of the era is often an overlooked figure, but is Alexander Hamilton. He is certainly someone who sees the benefits of creating a more stronger, a more efficient, government, much more fearful of the chaos from below than the tyranny from above. And so in each individual state, they took a look at this document and they debated, they argued, do we want to vote yes on this? Do we want to vote no on this? Now, in order to push, we might say, the yes side to win, the Federalists published a series of documents called the Federalist Papers. So these were a series of essays to convince people in states to vote yes on the new Constitution. And the authors of it, or the primary authors that we typically credit, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, who we mentioned earlier, James Madison, and a somewhat lesser known figure, John Jay. These were the authors of the Federalist Papers. And one thing that makes the Federalist Papers, interesting is that yes, they're designed to try and get people to vote yes. So there is a purpose behind them. But the U.S. Constitution in totality, it's not a document that is very detailed in some ways. It's not very long. It's not very specific. It kind of provides a general framework for how the government will work. And so it's really going to be up to a lot of lawmakers, Supreme Court, members of Congress in the next years to interpret the Constitution in a way that best benefits the country. And so for that reason, there's a lot of clauses and parts of the Constitution where we might not know exactly what the founding fathers had intended. One way in which the Federalist Papers are especially useful today is that the Federalist Papers, they provide an insight into the minds of the founders. We can go and look in the Federalist Papers and see what Madison has to say, see what Hamilton has to say, and this is our best evidence in terms of like what do some of these phrases in the Constitution mean? What is their intention? For example, something like impeachment. In the U.S. Constitution, it mentions that impeachment is presidents can be impeached or removed from office for committing high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, what exactly do they mean by high crimes and misdemeanors? That's where you would typically go to a place like the Federalist Papers to find more information. So they end up being very useful today in terms of like constitutional law. At the time period, they were designed primarily to convince people to vote yes on the new Constitution. And at the end of the day, it was the Federalist side that won. Ratification, we'll say the U.S. Constitution was ratified. What ratified means was that approved, voted yes on. In, what was it, 1788, I think was the year. So the federal side had won. The states had approved the new U.S. Constitution, and in the next couple of months, or maybe even the next year, they would hold elections to elect the first Congress. They would have the first presidential election. And, this was, in some sense, 1789 is when the U.S. Constitution goes into effect. A new Congress, president, et cetera, et cetera. This is the beginning of essentially a new era, the constitutional era, the current government that we have today. And so that's also an important thing to note is that the document they created in Philadelphia, 1787, went into effect in 1789. This is the same U.S. Constitution that governs the United States even today. It's one of the longest continuous governing documents in in the world. So, like I say, us students of American history were spoiled because we only have to learn 2 constitutions. Once you learn some of the basics of this one, it makes a lot more of American history from this point. It makes more sense, right? It's easier to understand. Now, there's kind of 2 last things to mention here, and this has to do with the fundamental structure of the U.S. Constitution. It's maybe the most basic structure of our government. And if you understand these 2 things, again, it just makes American history a little bit more digestible because you know kind of how things work at the governmental level. So one thing that the U.S. Constitution did was it created 3 branches. Those 3 branches are the executive branch, which is the president, the legislative branch, which is the Congress, that's the House and the Senate, and the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. But the U.S. Constitution also, in creating these 3 branches, separated specific powers and allow branches to have the power to check and balance each other. And the idea here is that a government in which responsibility and power is spread out prevents any one branch from being too tyrannical, right? So, for example, when we look at the passage of laws, right? How do laws get passed? Well, Congress, they essentially write the laws, right? They create the laws. But after Congress gets done writing and creating a law and then voting yes on it, it goes to the president or the executive, we'll say president. The president has the power to veto the law. So even if Congress agrees to pass a certain law, the president can actually step in and say, I'm not going to sign it, and that law won't come into effect. Now, that's not the end of the lawmaking process. In fact, if a president vetoes the law, it goes back to Congress, and with 2/3 of a majority, Congress does have the final say, right? This is simply just a check on congressional power. The judicial branch, they're going to have the ability to interpret the laws, right? So Congress writes the law, the president can reject it, and then once a law is passed, it's really up to the judicial branch, or we rely on the judicial branch to then say, okay, this is what this law means. And so we can see that when it comes to making a law, it really does require all 3 branches to work together, and they can, that power is separated. As far as checks and balances, probably the The best example of this is impeachment. And to impeach means to remove from office. And again, there are more examples of this in the U.S. Constitution. This is just a kind of an easy example: is that Congress can remove a president. Especially for those who have lived through the American Revolution that were part of this process. They were very suspicious of creating a U.S. president, believing that they could act like a king. And so the Constitution wanted to make sure that if the president, who they believed was most prone to abuse their power, if the president is abusing their power or is committing crimes or treason or anything like that, Congress should have the power to kick them out. And Congress does have that power. So that is certainly a check on executive power. So separation of powers, checks and balances, it's one of the fundamental structures of our government. And once again, understanding it, it's going to help kind of make sense of how the U.S. government operates. Now, a second important point or second important division of power, you might say, is federalism. Now, federalism doesn't have to do with the national government alone. It has to do with the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. And again, to avoid any confusion, this whole thing, the executive, legislative, and judicial, this is federal, right? This is within all of the federal governments. Now, each state governments, again, at the time, there's only one federal government. There are 13 state governments. Each state government has a separation of powers kind of like this. Whereas the federal government, we call it a president. The head executive of a state is a governor, right? A governor. But the U.S. Constitution also provides for a division of power between the federal government and the state governments. We call this federalism, right? Federalism is the sharing of power. I mean, it doesn't have to, it's the sharing of power between local and central governments, right? There is one government of the United States. There are 13 state governments. And so there are certain things that the U.S. Constitution provides only the federal government with the power to do, right? If we draw a Venn diagram, things like make war. Can New York declare war on France? No. The war-making power is only for the national government. Things like treaties, similar thing. Can New York make a treaty with Florida? No, that's not the case. Only the federal government has that power. Now, there are certain powers that only state governments have. I mean, most of these are things like criminal law. Typically when you break the law or commit a crime, you're committing a crime inside of a state. There are federal crimes. Things like education are typically done on the state level. Voting historically was always relegated to the states. They can make their own voting laws and their own processes. So there are certain things that pretty much state governments only do and the federal government doesn't touch. But then there is this spot in the middle. And a lot of American history can be summarized by this spot in the middle. And this is either responsibilities or things that both the federal government and state governments can do, or these are things that the federal government and the state governments fight over. And again, a lot of American history is the federal government and state governments fighting over certain powers and responsibilities. A good example here is taxes, right? Who has the power to tax you? Well, every April 15th, that you have to pay Uncle Sam, and then you also have to pay, whoever your governor is. So states and the federal government can tax you. And depending on what time period in American history one's referring to, you can usually find some sort of subject, right, in the middle here that the federal government and states are fighting over. So once again, as far as the general framework of the United States Constitution is concerned and the U.S. government from 1789 all the way until the present, I would say the two most basic structures. One is this idea of separation of powers, checks and balances, all within the federal government. The second one is this notion of federalism, the dividing or sharing of power between the federal government and each of the state governments. Section 5, rights and compromises. So one of the big disagreements between those that oppose the Constitution, the anti-federalists, versus those who supported the Constitution was this question about a Bill of Rights. So it was without a doubt that the United States Constitution marked a shift towards a more stronger, efficient government. And so the anti-federalists, they were the ones who were primarily concerned that maybe this U.S. Constitution that we've created and now ratified, because it's going to go into effect, maybe it's too strong, and this could pose a general threat to the liberty of a population. And so the Anti Federalists opposed the Constitution, but they weren't really organized in a way to provide a substitute, right? It's easy to be against something. It's harder to kind of suggest what sort of changes should be made. But the Anti Federalists did come to agree on one thing, and that was the new US Constitution ought to include a Bill of Rights. And a Bill of Rights, this was something that some of the state constitutions had used already. Virginia famously included a Bill of Rights. But a Bill of Rights, essentially what it does, it restricts the government from passing certain laws I will say taking certain actions. So essentially, the Anti-Federalists could say, okay, we agree, we're going to give you a stronger government, but you need to promise to us that these list of things, these are the types of rights and things that this government will not do. So the Bill of Rights, it's not something that governs, social or civil interactions, right? It's not designed to apply to people. It's designed to apply to governments, right? If you look at the language of the Bill of Rights, it actually says Congress shall pass no law that does this, right? Congress shall pass no law that that does that. The Federalists generally thought that the Bill of Rights wouldn't be necessary. The Anti-Federalists insisted upon it. Eventually, the Anti-Federalists won this argument, and that was essentially to come to a point to say, look, we oppose the Constitution, but if you include a Bill of Rights, then we will vote yes on it. And that was the agreement that was made. And the Federalists, and once the Constitution was ratified, they got to work on a Bill of Rights. Now, what was included, what wasn't included? The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. First 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights are the same thing. An amendment is a change or addition. That is to say that the initial U.S. Constitution did not contain a Bill of Rights. They had to go back and add it after it was ratified. And, that was one of the things that the very first U.S. Congress did, was to figure out what 10 things do we want to include. Boom, we're going to create this Bill of Rights, and the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution was created. So again, we're just going to kind of list a couple of them here. The first one, which has probably become the most recognizable and important one, this is the idea of freedom of speech, religion, freedom of the press, which is like news and assembly. First Amendment. Second Amendment, bear arms. The Fourth Amendment, we're not going to go over all of them because some of them aren't really that relevant. The Fourth Amendment is the amendment against unreasonable search and seizure. Just call it unreasonable search. It essentially guarantees that authorities need a warrant before they decide to look through your stuff, enter your home, stuff like that. The fifth one is self-incrimination. You may have heard the saying, I plead the fifth. Essentially, if you are convicted of a crime, you don't have to say anything, right? You don't have to incriminate yourself. You're innocent until proven guilty. 6, fair and speedy trial. So if you do get arrested and charged with something, you do get a trial. That was important coming from the Revolutionary period, where a lot of the colonists felt they weren't given a fair trial. And 8, no cruel and unusual punishment. And the 10th one, typically call this the states' rights. Pretty much just says, look, if there's anything that's omitted in this Constitution, we pretty much the states have the power to do that. So it's often invoked as as states' rights. So some of these have become very important from the moment they've been not the moment they've been enacted, but they've become much more important since the Bill of Rights was created. So, for example, something like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. Um, this is, in the eyes of many, probably the chief American principle. Some of these other ones, unreasonable search and seizure, fair and speedy trial, the ones that we've omitted, those are the ones that haven't been as relevant past, the 1790s and maybe onwards. But also, it's worth noting, your textbook points out what was not included in the Bill of Rights. So these were the 10 that made the cut. Um, what was not included was anything regarding women's participation in government. What was not included was an abolition of slavery. And a thing that also was not included was the right for all men to vote. Remember, voting was typically done at a state level, and that is to say, at this time, it typically required not just to be a man, but also to own property in order to vote. So, women's participation in government, abolition of slavery, and the right for all men to vote, that was not included amongst the first 10 amendments. Now, in addition to creating a Bill of Rights, the Constitution was also made up of compromises. And of course, we've talked in the last section about probably the compromise that is, was at the center of, the Constitution. And that was the Great Compromise over representation. But there was also another very important compromise. This was a compromise regarding the status of enslaved individuals in the United States, and that is the Three-Fifths Compromise, otherwise known as the Dirty Compromise. Now, it's important to note that at the Constitutional Convention, you had members from the northern states, you had members from the southern states. And in terms of what they argued about, what they did not argue about was that there was no debate over the abolition of slavery. So they weren't there to talk about would slavery continue to exist. That was typically something that they regarded as being in the realm of the states, right? If one state wanted to be free, they could do that. If one state wanted to be a slave state, they could also do that. What they did argue about, though, and this was the ultimate question that led to the Three-Fifths Compromise, is do enslaved people count towards representation? All right, remember that the Virginia Plan and the House of Representatives provided that a state's population would give them a number of votes. So the follow-up question was, well, are we counting the enslaved population? And in that sense, interestingly enough, it was the North that said no, slaves shouldn't count, because in the North there were fewer slaves. And in the South, they said yes, we should count slaves toward the population, because if you include the enslaved population, that would provide the South with more votes. The two sides went back and forth. Eventually, they settled on the Three-Fifths Compromise, which provided that it counted 3/5 of a state's enslaved population for representation. Right? So if we look at a state, and I'm just totally making up all these numbers, but if you looked at a state like Virginia, see if I can make this simple enough here. Let's say that Virginia has 100,000 people, and the way that the votes are divided up is that 100,000 people in Virginia gives Virginia 10 votes, right? 10 votes in the US Congress. This is the free white population, though. Let's say that the enslaved population is 50,000. So the question is, okay, well, does that 50,000, how does that get calculated in terms of the vote? Well, according to the Three-Fifths Compromise, that 50,000 is essentially going to be counted as 30,000, which will provide 3 more votes, which will give Virginia a grand total, 10 plus 3 of 13 votes. Right? So you can see that without counting the enslaved population, Virginia will get 10 votes. Counting 3/5 of it, it'll get 13 votes. And so the effect of this, right, the effect of the Three-Fifths Compromise is that it gave slave states more political power. And this would pretty much be the case all the way up until the American Civil War, until slavery would be abolished. Now, Northerners, although again it's a compromise, Northerners would prefer if the enslaved population didn't count at all. Southerners would prefer if the enslaved population counted completely. But Northerners were concerned about the impact that the importation of more enslaved individuals could have on the country. And that is to say, well, what's preventing Virginia from simply importing hundreds of thousands of enslaved people, allowing them to have so many more votes? And so part of the compromise and part of the agreement was to ban the slave trade. So slave trade ban, this was agreed upon or agreed to happen in 1808. So after 1808, it would be illegal to import enslaved individuals into the United States. Slavery would still exist in the US, and the slave trade could exist in the States, but importing slaves from outside, that was banned in 1808. And one of that, part of the reason was that it was for concern about Northern political power. But there were also 3 other reasons as to why Congress decided to ban the slave trade. The first one was that things were changing around the world, and Britain had banned it in 1807. Slavery, if we look at it a little bit more from a global context, slavery is more challenged outside of the US than it is in the US at this time. And so when Britain banned the slave trade in 1807, the United States wanted to follow suit, didn't want the British to have the moral high ground. The second one was the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is a massive slave revolt. And the slave revolt created fear. And so the belief was that, with the importation of enslaved individuals, if they came from the Caribbean, where they knew about the Haitian revolt being successful, that might cause revolts within the US. So part of banning the slave trade was to prevent revolt, prevent uprising. And a third reason why the slave trade was banned, it was to preserve the US as a white majority nation. Section 6, Hamilton's financial system. So recall that the most immediate concern for the nation was the economy. And in a way, you could say that had it not been for the poor economy of the 1780s, the United States Constitution would have never been written, because one of the major driving factors to create a stronger national government was to create a government that could deal with the current economic crisis. So, with the Constitution now in effect, the first president has been elected, George Washington. Part of the executive branch, or part of what Washington did as president, was to create executive departments, each of those headed up by a secretary. These departments would help Washington govern as an executive. And among the appointments, or among those that he chose to be part of the first presidential cabinet, was Alexander Hamilton, who was chosen to be Secretary of Treasury, right, in charge of the Treasury Department. So Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of Treasury, and in some sense responsible for the US economy. So it's really going to be up to Alexander Hamilton to try and get the United States out of its poor financial situation. Alexander Hamilton, not only was he the first Secretary of Treasury, but generally speaking, his positions was to expand federal power. Certainly somebody that believes a more efficient government is better, and really wanted to, what we say, promote industry. He was someone who believed that the United States should mimic Europe in terms of its economy, that promoting or fostering American manufacturing. He wanted to turn the United States into a producing nation. Washington also placed Thomas Jefferson to be part of his cabinet. Thomas Jefferson became the first Secretary of State. Secretary of State is kind of like diplomacy, right? To go out to other countries. But the point about Hamilton and Jefferson, they were both part of, again, this term is the presidential cabinet. And these are the close advisors. You can imagine the US president, he's one single person, but he's in charge of the economy, he's in charge of foreign policy, he's in charge of conducting war. He has a lot of responsibilities. So what the presidential cabinet does is it sort of divvies up responsibilities. Okay, Hamilton, you're going to be involved with the economy. Jefferson, you're going to be involved with the state. And he speaks with them on a regular basis in terms of getting the information and making a well-informed decision. Jefferson, though, dramatically disagrees with Alexander Hamilton. And one of the things that George Washington is often credited with is that he created a presidential cabinet of competing viewpoints, right? He wanted to hear all sides of an issue before he made a decision, rather than making a cabinet of all like-minded individuals. And this rivalry between Hamilton and Jefferson in the early years of the country really gets at the heart of some of the political disagreements that emerge. So Thomas Jefferson, he didn't want to expand federal power. He wanted to restrict federal power. And he did not see the United States as being an industrial nation. He wanted to promote agriculture, right? That the United States should not copy Europe. Jefferson believed that Europe was corrupt. The manufacturing, finance, urbanization, monarchy. The U.S. should actually distance itself from Europe as much as possible, and instead try and be an agrarian, rural nation. So the viewpoints of Hamilton and Jefferson gave rise to what would become the first two political parties in U.S. history, the Federalists and the Republicans. Now, sometimes the Republican Party is called the Democratic Republicans. This is simply to make the distinction between these Republicans and the other Republicans that appear in the 1850s. Right? So Democratic Republicans, this is the party from, I don't know, 17, what would we say here? we'll say 1796. That's the first election that Thomas Jefferson runs as a member of the Democratic Republican Party. And I think the last Democratic Republican candidate is John Quincy Adams in 1828. So these Republicans or Democratic Republicans are a much earlier party. The modern Republican Party today, that started in the 1850s. So I probably just made that more confusing than it actually was. But sometimes we refer to this party as Democratic Republicans to differentiate them from the later party. But for short, we're just going to call them, that these two are different political parties, right? They'll have the same name. Anyways, those that were like Hamilton, that wanted to expand federal power, that wanted to promote industry, they were the Federalists. right? So Hamilton was part of the Federalists. Republicans were Jefferson. We just want to take note that these are the first two political parties in U.S. history, right? In U.S. history. So once again, the most immediate concern is the economy. So now with a new constitution, with the ability to tax, with the ability to regulate trade, Alexander Hamilton now in charge. What are you going to do, Mr. Hamilton, in order to solve the economy? Hamilton creates a financial plan, and that financial plan consists of multiple parts, but we're going to go over three parts of Hamilton's plan: one, two, and three. And then the objections, and most of the objections are going to come from Thomas Jefferson, who again, he wants what's best for the economy too, but he doesn't see eye to eye with Hamilton. So, plan number one for Hamilton's plan to save the economy, the federal government was to assume state debts, right? Was to assume state debts. And so, with the ending of the American Revolution, war debt was a really big problem. Just like there were 14 governments, one national and 13 states, there was also 14 debts. Each country had, or sorry, each state had their own debt. What Hamilton wanted to do was he wanted to combine all the state debts together into one national debt to make it easier to manage, right? Instead of trying to have a kind of a scattered and spread out financial system, just make one national debt and then pay it back. Well, what were the objections? Well, some of the objections were that some states already paid their debts. This was true of the states of the South, right? So, some states who are maybe more financially responsible, or maybe better way of putting it is more financially prepared to pay off their debt, had already paid off their debts. And they didn't want to take on the debt of other states. And that's essentially what Hamilton was asking the states to do, to essentially, look, we're a big team. We want to centralize the economy, and maybe we ought to all pay off our debts together. Some states objected, right? No, if you have no debt, you don't want to combine. If you have a big debt, you probably want to combine. That way, you're not responsible for paying it back. You're forcing the other states to sort of help you. But in not just creating a national debt, right? The federal government was to assume state debts. We'll say and pay debt back. One consequence of paying debts back, specifically those who were called the creditors. Creditors are people who had loaned out debt, and essentially Hamilton was faced with a choice, right? In a bad economy, you have those who are called creditors. They loan, and you have those who are borrowers, right? Or no, other way around. Those who are called debtors, they borrow. And in a bad economy, debtors don't have enough money to pay things back. Creditors are the ones who lent out money. They're also angry because they're not getting paid back on their loans. Hamilton decided that he would favor the creditors, right? That he wanted the United States to focus on paying back the banks, paying back, the loans that had been essentially made out. And so by paying the debt back, one consequence that had happened from that was that speculators will say that many debts were passed to speculators who would become, say, rich under Hamilton's plan. So we got a little illustration here to help us illustrate the point of exactly how Hamilton's plan favored the speculators and why some people opposed it. So, during the American Revolutionary War, and it wasn't just the paying of US soldiers, but this was everything that the Congress paid for during the war. It's kind of simplest just to use the example of a soldier here. The Continental Congress did not have a lot of money. And in fact, a lot of US soldiers were paid in IOUs, right? Meaning that we are going to pay you back at a later time. We don't have the cash right now. Now, the value of that IOU could be anything, right? Could be something like $1,000. Well, when US soldiers received this money, these IOUs, as each week, month, and year went by, especially under the Confederation period, because remember, the Confederation couldn't tax, they couldn't pay back those IOUs. And so speculators came along and said, look, I'll give you cash right now for this IOU. But the cash value that was proposed was a lot smaller than what the IOU was. It might have been something like $200. So the speculator says, look, I'll give you $200. You give me this slip that says it's worth $1,000 because as a US soldier, you don't have a lot of confidence in the government. You don't think that they're going to pay you back. I mean, at this rate, they're never going to pay you back. So why don't you go ahead and take some cash now, and I'll take the IOU off your hand. And so what had happened in the meantime, right, before Hamilton got his plan or before the US Constitution was written, a lot of these debts had been passed on to speculators at a discount. So the soldier ends up with $200. Now Hamilton comes along and says, look, we're finally going to pay our debts back. So now $1,000 is going to these IOUs, and who gets that $1,000? Well, it's the people that had bought up the bad debt, right? It was the rich, it was the wealthy, it was the elites and the powerfuls. And so this emphasis on the creditors, there were some people who objected to, to that notion. The U.S. soldier who should have got $1,000 only got 200 in the meantime. The speculator who had bought up the debt ended up making a killing. So that was also a controversial aspect or a controversial feature of Hamilton's plan. The second part of Hamilton's plan was to create a national bank, right, to centralize the nation's finances. And the national bank could do, several things. It could be a place for the federal government to serve money. It could print a national currency, which would be very useful in terms of doing business because at this time, uh, each individual state had their own dollars, right, or their own money. A national bank would create a more centralized and controllable economy. Now, the objections to the national bank were put forward by Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, is going to object to pretty much all of these things. Jefferson said that this was too much central economic power. It's not a good idea. So, for example, one of the things that the state banks competed over were, sorry, one thing that the national bank would compete over are the state banks. The state banks are much smaller. And Jefferson is to point out, look, if you create a bank that is so powerful, can control all the smaller banks, this is too much power that could be potentially abused. The second objection was that it's unconstitutional. Jefferson pointed out, rightly so, that nowhere in the US Constitution did it allow for the creation of the national bank. Hamilton also rightfully pointed out that nowhere in the US Constitution does it ban or prohibit the creation of a national bank. And this is one of the ways in which the US Constitution is not super specific on some of these things. So those were the objections to the national bank. And the third and final plan, or part of Hamilton's plan, was to create an excise, right, additional taxes on things like whiskey, more taxes. And of course, the objection was simply just boo taxes. We don't want any more taxes. So 1, 2, 3, assume all the state debts, pay them back, create a national bank, create an excise tax. These were all parts of Hamilton's plan. Jefferson objected to pretty much all of them, but at the end of the day, George Washington approved. And Hamilton's plan went into action. All these things became true. A national debt was created, a national bank was created, new taxes were created, and for the most part, the economy did improve. Section 7, the Whiskey Rebellion and Jay's Treaty. So it wasn't only Thomas Jefferson who opposed Hamilton's plan. In fact, one of the more unpopular features of Hamilton's economic plan was the excise tax. And that excise tax, amongst other commodities, was on whiskey. And so when they attempted to collect these taxes in Western Pennsylvania, they found that Western farmers were not willing to pay them. Instead, what broke out was the Whiskey Rebellion. This was a rebellion against Hamilton's whiskey tax. Now, what was maybe more important was the response that the federal government had to this rebellion, because the Whiskey Rebellion, in a lot of ways, was similar to an earlier internal uprising, and that was Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion was evidence that the nation was not prepared to deal with armed conflict, whether that was internal or external. So this became a very important kind of a proving point for the new nation. And George Washington responded to the Whiskey Rebellion in a very strong way to show that the U.S. Constitution was prepared to deal with any sort of internal, shenanigans. And that is to say, Washington responded to this rebellion by raising, again, remember the new U.S. Constitution gave even greater power to conscripting a military force. Washington responded by raising 13,000 troops. And in fact, it really didn't even have to come down to any fighting, because once the rebels heard that Washington was on his way with 13,000 troops, the rebellion ended. It was relatively bloodless. But again, very important, and we'll just make a note here. Important to compare with Shays' Rebellion. Broadly speaking, when we think about Shays' Rebellion, that's seen as a failure of the government, as the Whiskey Rebellion seen as a success. Right? And this was proof, or this was evidence, that the new Constitution, as it was created and as it was enacted, did provide the tools to deal with something like an armed insurrection. And so Washington typically gets credit for his very strong response against the Whiskey Rebellion. And even though there will continue to be threats of internal rebellion moving forward, it's it's not as much of a crisis as it was, especially in the early years, right? Again, we have the benefit of hindsight. We know this great experiment of liberty works, but at the time, every single internal rebellion was potentially the end of the nation. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion might have been the most concerning internal crisis during Washington's presidency, but the most important crisis for the nation in this early republic period, without a doubt, is actually what's going on overseas, and that is the French Revolution. Now, not to go into too much detail about the French Revolution, but to make a long story short, the French revolted in a similar way that the Americans did. The French people killed their king, executed them, and wanted to create a democratic republic. When the French people executed their king and tried to create a new democratic government, the rest of the world essentially declared war on France. And so you have this period where we sometimes call them the French Revolutionary Wars from 17. When does the French Revolution start? 1789 to 1815. Sometimes these are also called the Napoleonic Wars, because during the course of the wars, you have somewhat of a lesser known general rise through the ranks to become the Emperor of France. But these wars are essentially, for 25 years, France is fighting everyone. Now, from the perspective of the United States, the two most important participants are Britain on one side and France on the other. And so, what effect this has on the United States is that the war between Britain and France, this disrupts U.S. shipping, right, the U.S. economy, and sort of puts the United States in a position to say which side does the US support, right? In this ongoing war between Britain and France. Yes, this is going to be a pain in the neck for American businesses who just want to do business. They get kind of caught up in this, naval war going on. But more importantly, which side do you support? Now, just like almost everything else in American society at the time, it's divided, right? The Federalists, they tend to favor Britain, and they mostly favor Britain. I mean, there's several reasons. I mean, there's reasons related to culture. So, for example, the British speak the same language as the Americans, have the same ideas about government. 20 years ago, the colonists were British. But maybe more importantly, it's commercial. Britain is where the dollars and cents are. Britain is a much more valuable trading partner. And if you're, betting money on this, if there's money to be won or lost, you want to favor the British side. But the Republicans, they actually favor France. And France, they're much more with the ideas, right? And specifically the revolution. Because what the French are trying to do are essentially what the Americans had already done, and that was to, have a democratic revolution and install a republican democratic government, get rid of monarchy, get rid of aristocracy, get rid of the old order. So there are a lot of people in the United States that say, yes, the French are doing the right thing. They're getting rid of monarchy. And so therefore we ought to support France. And so the country will remain divided. Again, Federalists favor Britain, Republicans favor France. And because this war lasts for so long, 25 years, this divide remains relevant in American society for the rest of this chapter and even in the next. Now, Washington wants to do his best to try and prevent the United States from favoring one side or the other. As a vulnerable country and as a new country, Washington finally decides that it's in the best interest for the United States to stay out of it. So Washington's neutrality declares the U.S. neutral. But this is a more difficult task than what it might seem, because this proclamation of neutrality ends up leaving both sides not really satisfied. The British were hoping the Americans would side with them. The French were hoping that the U.S. would side with them. When the United States says, "Look, we're not gonna be part of this," both sides are like, "Hey, what the heck?" And so it's this attempt to try and remain neutral for the next 25 years poses again, a very big threat to the United States. Now, an issue that the Americans will continue to have with the British is this practice of impressment. And I think we have talked about this in an earlier chapter, but impressment was something that the British had done to the colonists and continue to practice even after the American Revolution. And this is the practice of kidnapping U.S. sailors and force them to serve in the British Navy. And the fact that the British are continuing to do this, even though the United States is, I mean, it was seen egregious even when the colonies were part of the British Empire. But now that the United States is an independent nation and declaring its neutrality, the fact that the British are still willing and able to impress American sailors, this is a clear sign of disrespect. And again, it kind of reminds us of exactly the position the United States was in at this time. And it was not a superpower, right? It was very easily for the British to continue to disrespect the United States in this fashion. And this would, harm U.S.-British relations, right? This would continue to be a sore point between the two nations. With that being said, with some of the other issues arising as far as foreign policy was concerned, George Washington did attempt to remedy some of the issues with Great Britain. He sent John Jay over to negotiate Jay's treaty. This is a treaty between US and Britain. And for the most part, when we look at Washington's presidency, most of what he does is successful. There's a lot more to um, there's a lot more accomplishments than there are failures. But Jay's treaty, if there was anything that could be described as a failure or anything that could be criticized during Washington's presidency, this is one of them. So, what did this treaty with Great Britain actually do? Right. Well, one was that it called for Britain to evacuate U.S. Western land. And, I don't think that we had a chance to mention this yet, but one of the conditions of the Treaty of Paris when the British lost the American Revolution was that they had surrendered a lot of land and a lot of territory to the United States. The United States pretty much doubled in size, but the British hadn't evacuated it yet. They still had soldiers on US soil. And the US isn't really in a position to demand the British to say, look, hey, get off our country or get out of our country. In this vulnerable position, the US is kind of saying, look, Great Britain, will you please, will you please leave, right? Will you please leave? The second thing that Jay's treaty called for is to compensate for American shipping, namely, the British don't want Americans trading with France during the war. And so any effort to prevent that is harming American profits. Jay goes over there, says, look, you got to pay us back for the loss in American shipping. Part that maybe sweetens the deal for the British, we might say, is that Britain is made the U.S. primary trade partner. All right, so this is maybe a way to kind of sweeten the deal. And lastly, and this might be important, is that, and this contributes to some of the failure of it, is that nothing related to impressment. I mean, and even some of these other criteria of the Jay Treaty, they don't really get enforced. And the number one issue, or one of the issues that the U.S. had with Britain impressment, there are no, clear resolutions to that problem. To make matters worse, what does Jay's treaty actually accomplish? What does it really do? Well, it doesn't really settle the U.S. British tensions. All right, it's not as if the U.S. and the Great Britain and the United States are the best of friends after this treaty is signed. There's still a lot of issues that persist, including the continued practice of impressment. But to make matters worse, what the Jay Treaty looks like from the outside, at least from France's perspective, it doesn't look like the U.S. is being very neutral, right? Is a country that's neutral, do they go off and sign treaties? No. If you're neutral, you stay out of it. And so, really one of the more practical outcomes of this treaty, and again, contributing to its failure, is that it further alienates France. Right? France feels that because of this treaty, regardless of how successful it was, which it wasn't very successful, that this treaty is a sign that the United States is not really neutral. It's playing favorites, and the French are not. They're not happy about it. Section 8, French Revolution and the Limits of Liberty. So the French Revolution remains a major issue against the backdrop of early American history. And for the most part, it maps on pretty well to the different political ideologies in the country at the time. But the French Revolution itself also went through phases, some phases being a little bit more radical than others. Recall that the Federalists not only favored the British side in the French Revolutionary Wars, but they were also a little bit more scared or concerned about the potential of the French Revolution to cause anarchy from below. So we'll say about the Federalists, we might say worried about the chaos caused by the revolution. Whereas the Republicans, not only did the Republicans favor the French in terms of the actual war, but the Republicans more or less welcomed the chaos. They saw it as a good thing, kind of hearkening back to the way that Thomas Jefferson saw Shays' rebellion as maybe not such a bad thing. Maybe it's a good thing every once in a while for the people to rise up and depose of what they believe are tyrannical forces. This image here, this is showing you the death of someone, Louis Capet. Don't think is the king. I mean, the French did behead their king, but one of the features of the French Revolution was this device here called the guillotine, and the guillotine was an efficient and enlightened way of executing someone. And so during the French Revolution, the guillotine was utilized quite frequently to kill or execute those who were enemies of the revolution. However, though, the United States continues to find itself stuck in a difficult position because while maintaining neutrality, both Britain and France are not giving the United States the type of respect or recognition that it deserves. Remember, with the British, we might say that disrespect came in the form of impressment, or at the very least, not a respect for American neutrality. With the French, it came in the form of citizen Genet. Citizen Genet was essentially a French diplomat sent to the US to encourage US join France despite neutrality. Essentially, the United States said, look, we're not getting involved in this war. The French said, we don't really care. We're going to send someone over, try to convince you to join our side anyways. So again, an example of the vulnerable position that the United States was in, at least compared to other powerful nations at the time. Now, this dichotomy of the Federalists being afraid of the potential chaos of the revolution and Republicans welcoming it, well, during the most radical phase of the French Revolution, you had some Republicans reconsidering their support of the revolution. And that was during the phase known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror is the most radical phase of the French Revolution. And that was where anyone accused of being an enemy of the revolution was executed via the guillotine. We'll call this the bloody purge of counter-revolutionaries. And it's responsible, I think it says, what does our textbook say? 60,000? I don't have the exact number. But thousands of people were executed via the guillotine during the Reign of Terror, and this caused Republicans to reconsider their support. Right? The French had gotten a little bit out of control as far as the revolutionary was concerned, but as far as the overall picture of who sides with who in the war, it was still very much the case that the Republicans favored France, the Federalists favored Britain, but the Reign of Terror showed that maybe you could get a little bit too carried away as far as revolutions were concerned, and maybe it's not ideal to just behead everyone who was considered a counter-revolutionary. Now, in the meantime, George Washington served 8 years and decided to step down. In 1796, John Adams was elected second president of the US. And like Washington, John Adams tried to keep neutrality. And as we will see, as far as the French Revolution is concerned, Washington compared to his peers, Washington seemed to do the best job of keeping the United States out of the war. The presidents who succeed him, John Adams included, are going to have a much more difficult time really trying to prevent the United States from joining into this conflict. It was under John Adams that a quasi-war, not a full intentional declared war, broke out. And this quasi-war was between France and the U.S. We'll just call this the undeclared fighting, mostly with the Navy, between the U.S. and France. And France essentially ordered the attack against American ships, and there were two things that were causing that. One was Jay's Treaty, all that from last section, that from the perspective of France, the United States was not acting as a neutral partner and making treaties with the British. And so if the United States is making treaties with the British, then it's an enemy, and you should be able to attack them. But the second one was the fact that John Adams was a Federalist. And, in terms of measuring or gauging American relations, sort of where they sit in this British versus France divide, you could typically go by the president, right? And so if a Federalist is president, typically the French don't like that. If a Republican is president, then the British don't like that. So when John Adams won the election, being a Federalist, the French were saying, boo, boo John Adams, we don't want him. Both of these factors allowed France to say, look, we're just going to open fire on any American ships that we see out in the ocean. So again, a quasi-war, not a fully declared war, but it did cause a lot of paranoia at home. Now, John Adams, to his credit, did actually attempt to resolve the issue with France. This attempted resolution, and I say attempted because it doesn't work, is known as the XYZ affair. The XYZ affair, this was the attempt by Adams to, we'll say, smooth over French relations. And the result or the consequence of this was that the French demanded a bribe by the US. In other words, the French were not even willing to speak to the United States unless the US was willing to pay them. Again, showing you the imbalance of power between the French and the US at the time, that the Americans were not even worth their time, that they ought to pay the France just to allow them to speak with them. Of course, the Americans were completely offended by this, refused the bribe, refused to pay the French, and worsened U.S.-France relations. So much so that there were some people back at home that were demanding open conflict with France. In fact, Hamilton demanded war, right? So all of this is to say, right, this deteriorating relationship between France and the United States, the quasi-war, the fighting that is happening primarily at sea, the attempted effort to resolve that problem, the disrespect, the worsening of the relationship, all of this is the context for what ends up being the most important feature of John Adams' presidency, and that is the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? Because it's against the backdrop of this war that allows Congress to pass very controversial laws, right? So the Alien and Sedition Acts, these are two laws that can be seen as war measures. Right? They're passed because the United States is in a quasi-war in France. The Alien Act says the federal government can deport any foreign national. And what that means is essentially anyone who is a foreigner to the United States. Right? Any foreign national. Now, in terms of the way that it's interpreted, right, the Federalists and the Republicans have two different interpretations. The Federalists are saying, look, we need to have this power. We need the power to deport any foreign national, to deport French spies. Right? That is the accusation. The Republicans, and let's write this out, fusion. And this, this makes sense, right? The Federalists would say that the federal government needs more power, in this case, to conduct war. So having the power to deport any foreign national, right in line with what the Federalists would say. The Republicans would say that most of these foreign nationals actually support the Republican Party. And this is not a way for the Federalists to simply just pick out who they believe might be a French spy, but they actually believe that it's a political tool in order to get them more votes. So the Republicans would say that the Alien Act allows the Federalists to kick out Republican orders. The more egregious part is the Sedition Act, right? The Sedition Act, right? Alien and Sedition Act. The sedition part, this allows or outlaws, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. All right, so this is a law that will make certain speech illegal. And immediately, it might, intuitively, you might say, well, wait a minute, how can Congress pass a law that says certain false, scandalous, or malicious writing or speech is illegal? Isn't that a violation of the First Amendment? And, the answer is more or less yes. But we have to remember that the Bill of Rights, it was not seen as important then as it is today. Again, the Bill of Rights was not even part of the original U.S. Constitution. It was just in first 10 amendments. It was insisted upon by the Anti-Federalists. A lot of people believe that it was unnecessary. So there wasn't too much consideration gave to that. And once again, what the Federalists would say is that these are necessary for war measures. We can't have newspapers in the United States publishing any sort of pro-France material or criticizing the war because we need to conduct this war in a way that makes the United States most effective. The Republicans would say that this was not a way to silence opposition to the war. This was a way to silence opposition of Federalists. Right? This was a way for the Federalists to maintain their political hold or maintain their political control. And the Alien and Sedition Acts end up being very controversial laws as far as they're received. Opposition immediately comes from the Republican Party. It comes from the state of Kentucky and Virginia, which drafts a series of resolutions that challenge the Alien and Sedition Act. So the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, these are written by Madison, James Madison, and Jefferson, who are the leading Republicans. And they challenge the Alien and Sedition Acts. And one of the things that is invoked in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions is going to come back to something that we mentioned not too long ago, and that is this notion of federalism. Again, federalism is the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. So what what Jefferson and Madison say in the Virginia-Kentucky resolution is that states have the power to declare laws unconstitutional. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, what they're attempting to do, or one of the things that they're doing here is they're saying, look, in this division of power between the federal and state governments, we are invoking this side. We're saying, look, states have the authority to declare laws as unconstitutional. And so in some sense, we're saying that states have precedent over the federal government. Now, things got pretty tense, right? When these laws were initially enacted, there were some Federalists that wanted to go further, namely people like Alexander Hamilton that wanted to give the federal government even more power to conduct this war. The states of Kentucky and Virginia even began preparing their militias, fearing that this disagreement might lead to some sort of armed conflict. You had fights breaking out between members of Congresses, across the United States. So it was an especially tense time, and there was reason to believe that perhaps this divide could lead to the dissolution of the United States at the time. Now, luckily, it did not happen because there was an election in the year 1800, and the outcome of that election would ultimately determine the fate of the Alien and Sedition Act. All right, the last couple of sections, religious freedom and the election of 1800. So let's just make a quick note on this point about religious freedom. The first point is that the Constitution does not have an official religion. It is a secular document in that respect. But please also recall that, especially in this time period, a lot of power fell upon state government. So, we can look at something like the U.S. Constitution and maybe from that say, well, the United States is a secular country or has a very strong separation of church and state. But at the end of the day, a lot of the practical power lies at the state level. And as far as states were concerned, they more or less followed the same lead that the US Constitution provided and eventually ended up in a place in which the nation became much more secular, much more religious toleration. States went through a process of what is called disestablishment. And this is to say that between 1776, the American Revolution, when states could make their own decisions, and 1833, states removed official and tax-supported churches. Some states took longer than others. I want to say maybe Massachusetts was the very last state, but it was more of a process towards a strong separation of church and state. And of course, the result of both of these things, the Constitution and states going through disestablishment, was, relatively speaking, a strong separation of church and state. Strong separation of church. All right, so for the last section here, the election of 1800, it gets back a little bit to the political circumstances And recall in the last section, we talked about the very controversial, these laws were very controversial, Alien and Sedition Acts. And these were signed by John Adams, the second president of the United States. But John Adams was facing not just criticism from his rival Republican Party and Thomas Jefferson. Adams was actually trying to fight back other Federalists, namely Alexander Hamilton, who believed that Adams was not doing enough. So we think about the Adams presidency. Adams was facing criticism on the one side from Jefferson, but also facing criticism from the other side, Hamilton. And that didn't put John Adams in a very good position during the election of 1800, which was Adams versus Jefferson, right? Jefferson was the Republican Party, Adams was the Federalist Party. At the end of the day, John Adams was defeated. Thomas Jefferson and the Republicans won the election of 1800. And amongst other things, which the next chapter is going to talk more about Jefferson's presidency, the Alien and Sedition Acts expired. Jefferson got rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts. But Thomas Jefferson's victory, which makes him the third president in American history, was very significant at the time for the followers of Thomas Jefferson. In fact, they called his victory in the election of 1800 the quote-unquote Revolution of 1800. And this was to say, we'll just say this was the term used by Jefferson supporters. And this was really the first time, really ever, really the first time since the Continental Congress started meeting, even before the American Revolutionary War. This was the first time that those who were maybe skeptical of tyrannical power had control, right? If you think about from the First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, the Articles of Confederation, Constitution, George Washington, John Adams, that was always a process of strengthening the national government. The Continental Congress created currency and an army. The Confederation gave it some powers. The Federalists always wanted to give it some powers. So this felt like for the followers of Jefferson, those who said, maybe a little bit of revolt is a good thing, this was really the first time they were in power. So we might say the first time the Republicans, and even before them, the Anti-Federalists. Now remember, the Anti-Federalists and Republicans are two different things. The Anti-Federalists are those that just oppose the Constitution. The Republicans are actually the political party. It can be a little bit confusing because the term Federalist means both, right? But again, make that distinction. Republican, political party. Anti-Federalists were just those against the Constitution. First time the Republicans and Anti-Federalists are in power. Right, so maybe this is if you go back to 1775 when the war started, this was the first time that the people that were skeptical of centralized control were in power, and so therefore it's somewhat of a bloodless revolution. Now, one of the things that Thomas Jefferson wants to do in power is to reverse all the Federalist accomplishments, right? Jefferson, let's make a note here, wants to reverse what the Federalists have done. And he's successful in most of it. And again, next chapter we'll talk about it, but the Alien Sedition Acts, they are gotten rid of. But one challenge that Jefferson has is within the judicial branch. Now, this comes to federal judges, this comes to the Supreme Court. If you're unfamiliar, members of the Supreme Court are appointed by the president. So, since Washington was the first president, Adams was the second president, they were both Federalists. Essentially, the Federalists got to pick every single judge, right? And the sort of maybe a final boss for Jefferson and the Republicans is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. He is a strong Federalist. And we'll just take a note here that judges are chosen, we don't vote for them, by the president. And Jefferson's worst nightmare, these judges also serve for life. Right? They serve for life. And so Jefferson is really helpless in terms of trying to remove John Marshall or trying to remove these Federalist judges. They're appointed by the president and they serve for life. So this is something that essentially Jefferson is stuck with. But he's going to try every trick in the book in order to prevent any more Federalists from being judges. If it was up to Jefferson, he would completely purge the judicial branch and appoint all members that he supported. Now, John Adams, knowing this very well, actually stayed up until midnight on the very last day of his presidency, trying to create as many Federalist judges as possible. We call these the midnight appointments or the midnight judges. This is John Adams. What will we say? John Adams appointing as many Federalists before he is no longer president. Right? He's lost the election. And it's going to be his last day on the job. And so before he leaves, he wants to make sure that he can get as many of his guys in the judicial system as possible and make Thomas Jefferson's life as difficult as possible. One of those midnight judges was William Marbury. Well, I don't know if he was technically a midnight judge, but one of the judges was William Marbury, who Adams made a judge, or at least intended to, but did not, we'll just say did not, we'll say do the paperwork right. Right. Essentially, John Adams wanted Marbury to become a judge, but he didn't send out, the appointment. And so when Thomas Jefferson and James Madison came into office, they realized that Adams had wanted Marbury to be a judge. Jefferson and Madison did not want him to be a judge. And so Madison, who was working within the cabinet, Thomas Jefferson refused the appointment. So this leads to William Marbury to sue. And his court case gets all the way up to the Supreme Court in Marbury versus Madison. What's interesting about this decision, 1803, is that the court case Marbury versus Madison isn't really even known for the whole, the whole reason why it was brought up really isn't the important part here. Again, Marbury was one of these midnight judges, supposed to be a judge, didn't do the paperwork correctly. Madison comes in, says, no, I don't want you to be a judge. Marbury sues him. That's where the court case comes from. Now, the Chief Justice at the time is Chief Justice John Marshall. And again, remember John Marshall as being a very strong Federalist. That means he wants to try and centralize as much power in the federal government, but even just within the judicial branch. And he rules in the court case Marbury versus Madison in a very consequential way. And this ends up having very important repercussions down the line as far as American history is concerned. In all of American history, there are maybe 5 Supreme Court cases that you should learn, in a U.S. history class. This is one of them. Initially, Marshall denies Marbury. So in the short term, it actually looks like Jefferson and Madison win because they don't have this guy Marbury. He's not going to become a judge. But in this ruling, John Marshall does something else, and that is that he grants, maybe grants is not the right word, the judicial branch, judicial review. And judicial review is essentially the power to determine laws as unconstitutional. And judicial review, a very important principle as far as the separation of powers are concerned. When we think about the Supreme Court, the most powerful thing the Supreme Court can do is judicial review. That is to take a law that was passed by Congress and determine, does this follow the Constitution? Now, the US Congress can essentially pass any law that they want, right? They can pass silly laws. They can pass laws like the Alien and Sedition Acts. They can pass a law that say, everybody has to wear a red hat on Monday. If that law passes by Congress and passes by the president, even if 100% of people vote on it, judicial review essentially allows the Supreme Court to take the law, take the Constitution, and think of the Constitution as the rule book, right? Take the law, take the Constitution, compare the two. If the Supreme Court determines that it's unconstitutional, the law is null, right? Null and void. It does not apply. So this gives the Supreme Court a tremendous amount of power over the legislative branch. Essentially, today, what is 9 judges can determine or cancel out a law for, millions upon millions of people. So judicial review not only provides an accumulation of federal power, right? Because this will also apply to state laws, right? If a state passes a law, Supreme Court can come in and say, look, that law doesn't follow the Constitution. We're going to overrule you. But it also makes the judicial branch, which is the third branch, and at the creation of the Constitution was designed to be the weaker branch, no doubt about it. It makes the judicial branch more powerful and more equal. Right? We sometimes say that Marbury versus Madison or judicial review, it puts the judicial branch on the same level as the executive and legislative branch in terms of its power. So this ruling is somewhat ironic because it happens during the presidency of Jefferson, and Jefferson was always about limiting the power of the national government. And arguably, you have the single most significant accumulation of power happen at the federal level under Thomas Jefferson's rule.